I would like to talk with you about two approaches to language. There's two basic theories. One is a structural theory, and one is a post-structural theory. In this program, we adhere to more of a post-structural theory in line with our sociocultural commitments. But I want to explain the difference between both because it's an important distinction to understand in order to understand future theories, strategies, and practices in English language teaching. So these two approaches. From a structural approach, the meaning of a word is fixed, and the process by which the meaning of that word is created is a neutral process. From a post-structural perspective, meaning is seen as a site of struggle, where the process for creating the meaning of a word or an utterance is a social process. From a structural perspective, we think of words as either right or wrong. From a post-structural perspective, we think about the meaning of words as being dictated by those in power. Now you may be thinking, okay, this sounds okay, but who actually thought of these particular theories? So Sure, and is sort of this classic structuralist in language, and he identified this approach as thinking about the relationship between the sign and the signifier. This relationship was made fun of in some ways with the famous French painting of a pipe when it says, "This is not a pipe" at the bottom. Now more recent theorists like Bakhtin, Bourdieu, Hall, or Whedon talk about language from a post-structural perspective, and they call it discourse. From a discourse perspective, they're looking at both the social and the cognitive processes that happen as individuals in a society struggle over the meaning of words. And they create those meanings of words through interaction as a social process, not merely a cognitive process that's individual, but something that happens in negotiation with others. And in that process of negotiation, certain people are positioned to have greater power to influence the meaning of words, and others are marginalized within that social process. Another way to think about a similar distinction, again, connected back to our sociocultural commitments in the MAT TESOL program at the Rossier School of Education, are two different approaches to literacy. So now we're moving from generally two approaches to language to two more recent approaches to the written word, or literacy. The first approach, and this distinction, by the way, is based off of work from G, based off of work from the New London Group, and other literacy researchers and theorists who adhere to post-structural approaches. They call this approach social practice account of literacy. This is the social approach. The more individual approach, which aligns more with structural approaches to language, is an individual or hermetic account of literacy. From an individual or hermetic account of literacy, we see literacy as a singular, individual, and decontextualized act, something that someone does alone with a text. It is just the page, the words on the page, and the person's own cognitive processes. In contrast, we see a social practice account of literacy where we think about literacy as multiple versions of literacy occurring in myriad social contexts and highly contextualized by the person who's reading, the person who is writing, and the time and place that reading and writing occurred. From an individual or hermetic account of literacy, literacy is defined as the ability to read and write. From a social practice account of literacy, literacy is defined as a plural set of social practices, meaning that there's multiple ways to do literacy in multiple contexts with multiple individuals. From the individual account, again, think individual, one person, it's an asocial cognitive skill. Literacy is literally just happening between you and the words on the page. From a social practice account of literacy, we see it as a skill that is embedded in values and based on worldviews, a skill that's connected to one's identity, one's time and place and location in the world. From that individual or hermetic account of literacy, often researchers from this perspective will say that literacy leads to higher orders of intelligence, meaning literacy will make you smarter. A very specific type of literacy will make you smarter. In fact, this connects back to much older anthropological arguments around the fact that civilizations, or those societies that were civilized, were those that had a Western approach to literacy skills, to literacy in general, to reading and writing. From a social practice account of literacy, researchers argue that literacy promotes specific skills practiced in carrying out that literacy. For example, among the Vai people in Liberia, they learn literacy skills in 3 different languages. in a VI script, in Arabic, and in English. They learn those English literacy skills to do basic schoolwork. They learn VI to do commerce in terms of keeping books and contracts and agreements for commerce. They learn Arabic for their devotional for their devotion to the Quran and as part of their religious devotion. These are examples for this particular group, and this is a study by Scribner and Cole. These three different types of literacy it is an example from the social practice account, where we engage in different types of literacy activities in different languages or varieties of language for particular purposes. So it's not that the English language literacy practices of reading and writing and arithmetic that the VI people in Liberia learn in school is any more advanced or better than the long Quranic verses that those same people might memorize in their devotional practices, or is it any better or more advanced than the use of the VI script and language for commerce purposes? They're just different. They have practiced different skills for different ends. From an individual hermetic account of literacy, we would say the only literacy that counts is the one right account that they learn, the one right version of literacy that students learn in school, and would, in other sense, ignore maybe those literacy practices that the VI in Liberia engage in. I laugh because it's a small example, but they would oftentimes ignore the literacy activities and practices that those individuals engage in outside of, beyond the four classroom walls, outside of the school. Finally, I'd like to talk with you about two approaches to language variation. This follows the same logic from a structural versus more post-structural approach. This theory is brought to you by G, and James G, and he talks about bad English theory versus linguist theory. And these are really implicit theories that language educators often adhere to when they're thinking about the language variation of their students and the language varieties that their students use. From a bad English theory, it's much as it sounds, people learned from this perspective. The idea is that people learn to speak their language by exposure to intelligent and successful and well-educated people, either at home or at school, or both, and by being exposed to the writing of those people. From that bad English theory perspective. From a linguist theory perspective, what is grammatical or correct in a variety of a language is what fits the rules or pattern of generalization in the speaker or hearer's mind or brain. The speaking and writing of intelligent and well-educated people is what counts as correct language from a bad English theory. Whereas for the linguist theory, the human cognitive or biological capacity for language allows some patterns and disallows others. Although it's important to note that all allowed patterns show up in all languages, and that linguist theory makes a strong distinction between that which is an error in the usage or following of those particular linguistic patterns, and that which is variation, meaning differences that follow a particular linguistic rule. From that bad English theory, a language learner needs exposure to the correct language, motivation, and to be mentally equipped or smart to learn the correct version of English. From a bad English perspective, some people don't speak well or speak the correct version of English due to a lack of exposure to the correct version of English, due to individual motivation or basic smarts. From a linguist theory perspective, no one language is better or worse than any other language. If one follows a rule-governed language, then that's correct. And it's not, and from the linguist theory perspective, saying that some varieties of language are wrong and others are right makes no linguistic sense. It merely reflects broader social, cultural, and political hierarchies that put certain people's social practices, language, and culture above others. For example, many languages make a distinction in the imperfective aspect between a form meaning limited duration event and a form meaning an extended duration or repeated event. For example, in standard academic English or standard English, you might say, "My puppy followed me." Maybe a child in school might be talking about this. This example actually comes from James G. in some of his work. Now, in African American vernacular English or Black English, a child might say, "My puppy, he always be following me." Now we can see that in that example, the "my puppy followed me," both of these examples are correct from a linguist theory because they follow rule-governed approaches. One for standard academic English or standard English, for standard English, not standard academic English, and the other for African American vernacular English. Now we can see in "my puppy followed me" that that's a limited duration event. Whereas "my puppy, he always be following me," that actually allows that child to talk about the extended duration and repeated nature of that event. In many ways, the second example allows us to understand more details about the action of the puppy following the child to school. Now, from the linguist theory, teachers or applied linguists or educational theorists might say different language varieties are equally good and grammatically correct. And either "the puppy followed me" or "the puppy, he always be following me," those are two appropriate or correct ways to talk about a past action. The sentence "my puppy, he always be following me" is incorrect from a bad English perspective because it does not fit the model used by quote-unquote intelligent or well-educated people. That is, a linguist theory perspective would say that's a thinly veiled way to say that the only intelligent or well-educated people are those who are in positions of racial, class, gender, or other, are in positions of power or in positions of relative advantage in racial, class, or gender hierarchies. A bad English theorist might argue that it's incorrect because that child who said, "my puppy, he always be following me," hasn't been exposed to the right models of English, possibly lacks individual motivation, or is not so smart. The linguist theory says that is just adhering to that particular perspective on that child's contribution to the class is, one, not useful, and two, incorrect when grounded in applied linguistic theory and educational research. Just to sum up the differences between bad English theory and the linguist theory in terms of its consequences in the English language classroom, bad English theory can often blame the victim as incorrect, less smart, less motivated, or not having intelligent or caring parents simply because there is a mismatch between their language variety and a language variety that is a close fit to standard academic English. Whereas a linguist theory recognizes that a child could possibly be exposed to multiple language varieties, and that none of those language varieties are inherently spoken by more intelligent or more well-educated people. Rather, from a linguist theory perspective, it's incumbent upon the language educator to help the child learn how, or the language learner for that matter, to learn how to understand which varieties are appropriate in different contexts. So, for example, it's important that a teacher, if the teacher is working with a child who says, "my puppy, he always be following me," it's important that the teacher recognizes that that is not an error, but that is a detailed and sophisticated way to share a story with the classroom. Then it's also important for the teacher to scaffold or support that student in learning how to translate that particular story or particular sentence into standard academic English, because standard academic English, as Lisa Delpit explains, is a code of power within the educational system and in many professional contexts. So it's incumbent upon the teacher to not see a variation as error or lack of motivation or intelligence, rather to see it as an additional resource that the student brings to the classroom. And then when the teacher can connect a student's previous knowledge or the language varieties that the student does use to the target language variety, which in the classroom is often standard academic English, that student will actually learn standard academic English better, will be positioned more positively within the classroom, and will see a space for their funds of knowledge and linguistic varieties within the classroom, but then also excel within the given constraints of the language classroom and the social realities of the school and the community where they find themselves. From a linguist theory perspective, there are social and material consequences to the language variety that an individual chooses to speak in different social contexts. Within the social context of schooling, it is important that students are supported and acquire standard academic English in order to succeed. A similar requirement is also present for many professional contexts, where individuals are often required, say in a job interview, to use standard academic English. Now we will talk about the importance of language awareness in the next video, and the importance of making students aware, meta-linguistically aware or reflective of their own language use and the way that they use that language in different contexts. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this unit.